Welcome to Session D of the SQA September virtual meeting. My name is Johanna Wilson, and I will be chair for this session, which will include the following presentations and speakers. System-focused versus process-oriented CSV audits. Fish your data. Can you catch it? Presented by René, Kasan, and Manu, Reddy. And RWDE from a GCP perspective, presented by Kasan. The presentations in this session have been pre-recorded and will be broadcast in the order listed here. Please note that some of the talk titles and the names of presenters may have been updated since this was recorded. At the top of the screen, you will see the list of speakers for this session. Click on the speaker's name to view their profile and read more about them. The presentations today represent the presenter's opinions, not necessarily those of SQA. You can submit questions and share comments throughout the presentation using the chat function. Click on the chat button at the top of the screen. This will open the chat at the bottom of the screen. The presenter will do their best to respond to questions via the chat while the presentation is being broadcast. If there are a number of unanswered questions at the end of the session, the presenter will provide written responses after the virtual meeting has concluded. These written responses will be available along with the recordings and slides. There will be a brief pause between the broadcasts of talks within the session. Once all of the recordings have finished playing, the session will end and there will be a break until the next session begins. Be sure to consult the schedule to confirm what time things will resume. Recordings and slides that have been released by the presenter will be available on the On Demand tab in the virtual platform. You can view these recordings at any time. During breaks between sessions, you are encouraged to visit the virtual exhibit hall. Here you can visit the exhibitor booths and view virtual posters. We will have a prize drawing for visiting booths in the exhibit hall. You will earn 30 points for each exhibitor or poster booth you visit. Once you've earned over 450 points, you will be entered into a drawing to win an Amazon gift card. Thank you for joining us for this session. The presentations will now begin.
Manu and myself would like to welcome everybody to our presentation that goes by the title System-Focused versus Process-Oriented Computer Systems Validation Audits. Fish your data, can you catch it? We would like to first speak a little bit about the motivation of this presentation to get started and to set the stage. And basically, Manu and myself, we have conducted a high number of audits in the past. And in most of these audits, we set our focus for the audit on a dedicated system/application. So basically, there was one computerized system, and we went and saw the system owner as well as the process owner. And we looked into the validation documentation of the entire system and checked for the validated state. And that worked pretty well in the past. But also, we rather recently encountered quite some limitations of this approach. For instance, we had the case where we audited an application and we found out that this application was not storing the data anymore. So basically, we could not answer typical questions and look into a validation documentation to see straight documentation about what is the electronic record, what are the predicate rules, what additional capabilities on the audit trail are in place, and so forth. So in order to understand that, we had to set this application in the context of a greater, bigger environment, because the application or the system was pulling data from a centralized pool, processing it and pushing it to that pool again. And so we were thinking about how can we address that better in the future? And that rang our bells where we said we must look via the process. What are the right fragments of the process to audit? And what data elements do we have in there? And how is this data flowing? And that is basically the motivation. And that is also what this presentation will be about in the next 20+ minutes. Before we get started, we just would like to draw your attention to the fact that we are here presenting as individuals and that all the opinions we express here are our own opinions and cannot be associated with any organization we are employed with or we are affiliated with. So how is our presentation structured? First of all, we speak, of course, about objectives and scope in order to just take it off the ground. And that is followed by tackling the question, what is in it for me? Then in the third chapter, we are setting the stage talking about data and also talking about what are the typical needs of an audit program manager and what are the typical needs of an auditor. What questions do we want to answer here when we go out into the field and audit? Thereafter, we set up some virtual scenarios and we would like to discuss these scenarios along taking a process-oriented versus a system-oriented approach of slicing and dicing the audit scope and discuss advantages and disadvantages of each of the approaches under the given scenarios. Last but not least, we would like to provide to you a little checklist with some steps you might take into consideration when planning your program or when also planning your individual audits. And we wrap up, of course, by a conclusion. Objectives and scope. So in our presentation, we would like to learn, we want to foster that, and we would like to assess, and we would like to leverage on the learnings. And our goal is to learn about what is in the audit program, what challenges are there in the audit program planning process, especially if you are facing contemporary application landscapes. And we would like to set the focus on business process driven cross systems data flows here. Second, we would like then to assess these two diametral aspects of looking at the system versus looking at the process when it comes to planning your program, your audit program, or when it comes to planning your individual audits. And then we want to leverage on all of that experience and put it into a checklist, which hopefully is of help for you when you do your next audit program plannings. So just to sum up, audit program scoping criteria are in scope, a simplified scenario discussion, followed by a simplified checklist as well. Out of scope, of course, is that there is no one size fits all. So we can basically not give you the turnkey solution for each and every situation in the field. And also we will not discuss complex scenarios. So the principles and concepts you must apply yourself to your individual environments. What's in it for me? Again, it depends a little bit, and we took the position that it might be of interest if you are in the position of an auditor or audit program manager, and if you belong then to the most of world outside of this definition, and if you're experienced or a newbie. And if you're in the field for quite some time, and if you've encountered the changes in the application landscapes, probably you'll find quite some confirmation here, some inspiration, and some reflection on what you're doing already in your field. If you're rather new here, we would like to draw your attention that most of the things are around data and how data flows, because that is subject to regulatory regulations. And we would like to share the knowledge here, and hopefully you can tie that into your planning processes. Out of the audit program world and auditor world, again, it is important to understand how important data is in our industry. So we want to, again, foster that knowledge and create that sensitivity in that area. Also for you to better understand the scope when you are in the position of an auditee. The staging chapter. We would like to first say a couple of words on data, because data is all that matters, especially in our regulated industry, in the pharmaceutical industry, in the medical device industries. So we see more and more IT data processing capabilities coming along the way. And we try to cluster them around certain aspects just to convey again the message of how important data is nowadays. Data management, that for sure is in the heart of all of these considerations. It means that how is the lifecycle management on data? How is data created? How is it processed? How is it pushed? How is it decommissioned? But again, there's more. What is the data lineage? What is the traceability? What about profiling? What about manipulation of data? And what about metadata management? Meaning, yeah, to have data on data in order to add certain additional quality to it. Then, of course, integration is a topic when we speak about data, because we have data sources everywhere in our corporations and outside of the corporations. And there is a high need to integrate these data in order to fulfill business needs. Data curation is also a topic and a capability we see more and more coming into the field. So what do we mean? What is the assessment basically of the quality of my data? What about data transformations? What about standardizations and harmonizations here? So that these capabilities we summarize under curation. And then, yes, regulatory or regulated industry subject to regulatory requirements, compliance is of importance here. What is the data governance? What about security? What about audit trailing? How can we, under controlled situations, route the data via workflows to the organization? That all falls under compliance. And last but not least, we of course do not forget the data recipients, which falls into the capability of reporting. So all of these capabilities we were just discussing because they have quite an impact on the architectures and how they are changing over time. So we very simplified here this evolution, starting with a low maturity landscape where we had scattered systems and individual data systems for each of the systems pretty much encapsulated. And we know that for sure, these environments become less and less or will less and less be in the real world and will be decommissioned and will be replaced by other architectures. And that is a journey that goes up the arrow here. We have a medium maturity environment we could or might possibly face where we have scattered systems which are individually connected. Maybe we even have a centralized data pool in here via which communications takes place, or they are clustered by automation and integration platforms. And then, of course, what we are also seeing is these integrated solution packages with business process oriented verticals you can enable or disable dependent on the needs of your organization, as well as more and more the advent of data lakes that are built in order to fulfill the various needs. But again, and I mentioned it already, regulatory requirements and data integrity needs are out there. And we are happy to cite Dr. Gosch again, who gave a presentation at the annual meeting 2018, speaking about data integrity concepts, where she was mentioning topics and covering topics such as metadata, audit trailing, static versus dynamic records, backup data, and computer systems validation. And what it comes to at the end is to the topic of data integrity, which is not a new topic, but a topic that has been around for a long time. And what we mean by that is completeness of data, the consistency of it, and of course, the accuracy. So we have to fulfill these data integrity requirements because they have been around there for a long time. Now, if we take all that together, then it comes to the question of how do I best plan my audit? And we tried to cluster these criteria around four buckets. Maybe these are not the ideal buckets, but for us, it was a crisp way of looking at it. And so the first we called regulatory requirements. When we plan our programs and when we plan our audits, what business process are we talking about? And what regulatory requirements are in the field that govern these areas? And in these requirements, what are the predicate rules we have to be compliant with? So that is a very important driver when we do our audit program planning. And then it comes, of course, to the records and to the topic of data integrity. In these requirements, what is mandated for what records and what controls do I have to put to set forth in order to comply with the regulations? So questions such as, can I define my electronic record in the sense of the requirements? Can I differentiate between manual processing versus electronic processing? Do I have a crisp view on how the data is flowing through the organization and is processed where? Do I know where data is located? Where is it stored in my landscape? And do I have qualified copies of that data? And what controls are in place where on the data? For instance, maybe even the audit trail capturing control and capability. And last but not least, who owns the data? And then we want to look, of course, when we plan our audits, on how the documentation is sliced and diced on the computerized systems validation. How is it structured? Do we have always individual validation plans? Do we have actually embracing validation plans that cover several systems? How is the specification, testing, and verification organized in the papers when we go and review the papers? That all has an impact so that we can trace the right documented evidence by the right setup of our audit program. And then, of course, what are the computerized systems along the business processes? Inventory of the system, controls in the landscape, where is relevant data stored, and shall audit trail review processes be established? What is the data lineage? What are the dependencies? And what is the traceability of the data in these complex environments? Of course, it's also, last but not least, very important to have the right scoping in order to conduct the appropriate risk assessment. And all of these criteria we must take into consideration when we set up our audit endeavor. And in order to better explain now what are advantages and what are disadvantages of each of the approaches, looking just on an individual computerized system with one application centralized, or looking along a business process where we check how data flows, that is now the topic Manu will take us a step further.
Thank you, René. So now I will talk through some scenarios. So for the sake of discussion, we are focusing on 3 different scenarios here. And this doesn't mean that there are just these scenarios. So let's have a look at the IT landscape for each of these scenarios. The first scenario is scattered applications with individual data silos. In this scenario, we are looking at dedicated computerized systems supporting individual process steps with dedicated repositories. This scenario seems to be gradually fading. And an example could be a standalone lab systems. The second scenario is the satellite applications with data hub. Individual steps are supported by dedicated computerized systems, and eventually the data collected from these individual systems are funneled into a centralized data repository. So an example of this could be the landscape with a centralized data hub application. For example, like the some of the safety data could be collected through various systems, but eventually stored in one centralized system. In the next scenario here, the scenario is a business process driven automation platform. On top of the IT landscape, automation platform embraced processes supported by dedicated computerized systems, centralized data repository. So as René had already mentioned, the technology keeps growing day by day, right? So this seems to be coming on board more and more. One of the examples that I see is a collection of critical data following the business process involving multiple computerized systems. So now let's take a deeper look at the scenario, just to give you a representation on how this scenario could be, and what layers in the IT landscape are. So if there is an SOP, let's say, defining a process, in scenario one, where each system is collecting or supporting one process, and the data collection happens at the at the single system level. So that means there is an individual data repository for each of these processes. The data collection happens in the siloed systems. So that, of course, there are multiple systems across the board for each of these processes. And let's see how the IT landscape and if we compare the system focus versus the process focus, it's there are pros and cons like anything else, right? So in the system focused, see the regulatory requirement specifications could be followed easily. Record criteria, is clearly documented. And when you look at the process side, right, it's added, it's not so easy to follow the data lineage because the data is scattered in individual systems. It's not easy to follow the data, connecting the dots, because it's just because the data is scattered in multiple places. So I would say, this scenario, it's more system focused. If you are looking at this criteria, then then this system focus things would be more advantageous. And now, just following through, let's look at the second scenario. Where individual systems are collecting the data, but they are funneled into a centralized repository. So let's evaluate the landscape and the system focus versus the process focus. In this, if it's system focused, the regulatory requirement focus is difficult to set, and the record criteria determination is difficult, and audit trail review is also difficult to just connect the dots, because it's conducted through individual systems, but and eventually it's going through a centralized repository. So if you want to track the pattern, from the beginning, it would be difficult. But at the same time, if you're looking at the process side, the data lineage would be an added benefit, and it would meet the lot of the criteria on the process side. And that, I would say, it would, this data lineage would be, in this scenario, the process side would be more advantageous. And last but not least, the scenario 3, where automation and integration layer is involved, including extra data management capabilities. So this is the platform embraced, process steps supported by dedicated computerized system with a centralized data repository. So if you look at the landscape, right, so if you look at the process, you can follow through the process, you can track the requirements, the record criteria, the records can be traced back. So there are, things that are more easily traceable in this scenario, and it all depends on the requirements and the objectives of the audits you're trying to achieve. So this would be things that are more easily trackable, on the process side, to track the data lineage. And just to recap what we have discussed so far, just to give you an overview. So analyze the business process landscape. Look at the business process that is in scope of the audit program. Look at the IT landscape. This is very important. Computerization degree of business processes scope. Look at the architecture and design of the IT landscape. Determine the audit program needs, what is required as part of the, what is the objective of your audit program. Look at the regulatory requirements. You want to check the data integrity, the computerized systems and validation, and derive the audit program plan. Look at the pros and cons. What would be more advantageous? Should you consider the business process aspect, or should it is the focus just on the IT systems? So take that into consideration. Execute, refine, update. I guess it's a learning is continuous, right? Sometimes it's a continuous process. You just have to go through several iterations to see what best fits the business needs. So execute the audit program, analyze, refine, and update, And just going on to the wrapping up, the presentation, the conclusion, so the objectives, we saw learn, apply, and solve. The flow, staging, the setting, discussing, and provided some advice on what could be, some scenarios as an examples. So the takeaway, look at the IT architecture, drive the audit program and planning and approach. Regardless, data is the key, and set the rules. And process view likely to prevail with future, future technological advancements. So this is becoming more and more as we get more and more data. It's only going to grow, so next step. So, any questions? René and I can be reached. This is our contact information if you're interested in reaching.
Okay, very good, Manu. And last but not least, of course, the credits to Dr. Ghosh, which we cited in our presentation, where we are more than happy that we could do that. And with having said that, that's the end of our presentation. And as Manu said already, thanks for the attention, and we look forward to your questions and to further discussions. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.